What we do in our lives is done with other people, and what is society? It's people doing things together with each other, for each other, in their communities, for their communities. Lots of little societies coming together to form a big society, and lots of it informal organisations such as this, workplaces, all these kinds of formal clubs. Lots of it's informal, just informal associations, people doing things together. So what's a big society, a bigger, stronger society? Not very complicated, really. It's more people doing more things together in more ways, in their communities, for their communities. Not very difficult to grasp, really. So what's new about it? Well, lots of it isn't new, actually. We've sometimes thought the way to kind of tease into separate strands what we as a government want to do to promote Britain being a bigger, stronger society, we think there are kind of three strands to it. And what are they? One is about how you deliver public services, and there's no particular order, and there's lots of overlap between them, and not kind of separate. They're like a Venn diagram, and there's quite a lot of activity that is in the overlapping bit in the middle. How do you deliver public services? And we want public services to be delivered in a way that's more open in the sense more different types of organisations providing public services. To a much greater extent not delivered by in-house monolithic public sector organisations, more by, in many cases, private sector organisations, in many cases voluntary charitable organisations, and the work programme, welfare to work programme that Doug Smith just launched will have a huge amount of the activity, none of it actually delivered by the state as such, and a huge amount of it delivered by voluntary and charitable sector and social enterprises. But open public services also in the sense people have more control over it, where they can exercise choice, personal budgets where that's appropriate, to the maximum extent, exercising choice between different providers, more control for the users of public services over those public services. So first strand, open public services. Second strand, civil society, social action. And then again, there's nothing new about this, but we can do much more. And this is, to some extent, it's about formal organisations, charities, set up, registered, all of that, but lots of it informal, and people just doing things with each other, for each other, in their communities. So social action, and what are we doing there? Stimulating philanthropy, giving of time, giving of money. And we are a generous society, but actually we're not nearly as generous as we might be, or indeed as we have been as a society. In the late 19th century, the Booth Report into Poverty concluded that the typical middle-class family was giving 10% of its income in philanthropic giving. And we compare actually giving in between income levels. Poorer people give disproportionately a larger part of their income in charitable donations than richer people. It's a startling and counterintuitive fact, but it is a fact. And the third strand is localism. Decentralisation, pushing power away from the state, from the centre, yes to local government, but beyond local government as well, into communities. This is where the role of community organisers can be really important. People often feel very frustrated, very impotent in their ability to fashion what's going on in their own neighbourhood. We sometimes say that there are some places, some parts of the country, particularly some estates, where there's not very much social capital in the sense of the activity, the sort of stored activity, the habit of collective social activity, bringing people together to work together. I've never come across anywhere where there is none. That we sometimes say, well, this is a bit of a desert for civil society. There's nowhere where there's nothing happening. There's nowhere where there is no one who is exercising some sort of leadership, community leadership. And sometimes the places you go to where you find some of the most inspiring examples of community leadership are places where there's least organisation, least formal organisation, but most vigorous community activity. And it's normally focused around an inspirational, charismatic leader who's bringing people together and helping to generate collectively that sense of community activism and activity, that sense of self-help, self-communal, self-reliance. So where do community organisers fit into that? Well, it's not a substitute for social action, absolutely not. This is not the state sending someone along to do things because people aren't capable of doing it. There is nowhere where there are no people capable of doing things or stimulating activity, communal activity in the neighbourhood, in the community. But there are lots of places where the activity and the energy and the skill base of a community organiser can act as a real catalyst to that energy and the dynamism that may be latent, but it will definitely be there. It's a catalyst for more social action, and it's looking for, who are the community leaders and who are the groups which may be formal, more likely to be informal. How do you connect them together? How do you find the support for them, maybe with local businesses who can give them a bit of support, maybe actually helping them to make a bit more noise, because we know that the groups who often get most support from the local council are the ones with the loudest voice and the best organised, and often it's the ones who are least organised, least savvy about working the system that get least, and a community organiser can help them to amplify their voice. So the community organisers, and what our plan is, and we have this programme underway now, is to recruit and train 5,000 community organisers, 500 of them senior, who would we expect to be full-time community organisers. And they will be community-led. We're stimulating their creation, but they will be independent of government, independent of local government, and should be independent of vested interest. And what those communities choose to do, it'll vary from place to place. It might involve projects to address antisocial behaviour. It might be an opportunity to start a social enterprise. Maybe a social enterprise that's then able to exercise the right to challenge the way in which public services are delivered locally, to bring them together, to deliver public services fashioned around the needs of the neighbourhood. We all know that top-down public services tend to be configured to meet the expectations and targets of people sitting in ivory towers remotely, in Whitehall or Town Hall or wherever, but a distance away from the neighbourhood. The public services that work best are the ones that are configured around the needs of that neighbourhood, that estate, maybe even that family or that individual. And actually, if we want to tackle the deep-seated social problems, the multi-generational social problems that bedevil too many parts of our country, then instead of, as we far too often do, ineffectually managing the symptoms of failure, we need to focus resources in a much more collective way in solving the underlying problem. When you think about the scar that defaces this country, of a prison population that's larger than anywhere else in Europe, not because people in Britain are worse than other people in Europe, but because our rate of reoffending is lamentably high. Then you look at the composition of our prison population and you see that in roughly kind of equal proportions, a half, and these are, as you will see from the numbers, overlapping proportions, half will have some kind of mental health problem, half will have some kind of addiction, half will have some degree of literacy problem, quite often very major, and lots of overlap, and plenty who hit all three categories. Unless we start in a really focused way to solve the problems that these people have. We're not going to break the cycle of constant reoffending. And when we're effective at breaking the cycle, it's very rarely the state that does it. It's generally some kind of outside agency that will do it, very often a social enterprise or a voluntary charitable organisation that can configure, has the flexibility to configure what's needed, deliver what's needed around the needs of that family or that individual. And we believe that one of the things that community organisers can do is to stimulate the creation of the enterprises, the organisations that can do that, are able, flexible enough, resourced enough, can mobilise the resources needed to make that effective. So, as community organisers, supported by our Community First Fund, which aims to support greater community action, targeting areas with higher levels of deprivation and lower levels of social capital. Community First must complement the work of community organisers, provide funding incentives for groups and neighbourhoods that want to improve local conditions. And as we move to changes to the planning system, which we've loosely called open source planning, ground up, bottom up, community-based neighbourhood planning, there has to be in those neighbourhoods that want the ability to shape the destiny and shape the future of their community, of their neighbourhood, there has to be the ability to come together in some collective way to articulate the vision of what they need. Again, community organisers can support that. Community First Fund can help to resource it. So there's a fair amount going on to support this kind of activity. It's obviously against the backdrop of fiscal retrenchment, long words for spending cuts. Sometimes people say, well, all this talk about big society, and indeed the Archbishop of Canterbury said this, despite actually having invited a group of us to lunch at Lambeth Palace, where he told us what a great idea he thought the big society was and how could the Church of England help to deliver it. And he fell into this lazy cliche, so, oh, big society is just a cover for cuts. Well, if it is just a cover for cuts, it's not a very good one, because we have said very explicitly that public spending has to be cut, and we are doing it. We are absolutely not trying to cover up the fact that there are cuts. Britain inherited, the coalition government inherited the biggest budget deficit in the developed world. It's a proportion of national income, it's bigger than Greece's. We needed to, and yet as a result of the steps we're taking to cut spending and eliminate the structural deficit, and this sometimes gets lost sight of, and actually is the reason why we don't have, at the moment anyway, maybe different tomorrow, scenes like you see in Syntagma Square in Athens, is that we got interest rates because of the steps that are being taken to deal with the fiscal crisis. We've got interest rates and the level of Germany's. Well, we've got a budget deficit at the level of Greece's. Makes a difference. Greece's interest rates, 70%. Our interest rates, market interest rates, 3-point-something, 4-ish%. Big difference. The result of those spending cuts is absolutely inevitably, I'm afraid, cuts in public funding for a number of civil society organisations. We sometimes forget 75%, 3/4 of voluntary and charitable organisations receive no public funding whatsoever. Many of those that do receive some are not dependent on them. For those that have been dependent on public funding, we made available the Transition Fund to help them through to the point at which there will be more revenue available for successful social enterprises and voluntary organisations bidding to deliver public services. And the work programme is only the first tranche, first stage in that. But it doesn't stop it being a really difficult time, and I'm acutely conscious of that, which is why we need to do everything we can to mobilise support in society from people and organisations to support civil society organisations, because that in its turn is part of us being a bigger, stronger society. Thank you very much.